The man who finally agreed to speak after all those silent years did not look like a villain at first. He was not wearing a black coat, he was not hiding in a smoky room, and there was no dramatic envelope on the table. Only a careful old voice, a cup cooling beside him, and the memory of guitar cases being opened one after another. If people had known then that Peter Posa was letting go of 11 of his 13 guitars, the whole country might have heard the alarm bell. But at the time, the sales looked ordinary enough, almost polite, almost tidy, the kind of private decision a proud musician makes without asking permission. Who bought them? Who watched them leave? Who decided not to ask why a man whose fingers had once sounded like quicksilver was suddenly parting with the very tools that had made him immortal? And why did so many people close to the music pretend not to see the tremor inside the transaction? For decades, Peter Posa had belonged to that rare class of musician whose name did not need shouting. In New Zealand living rooms, in dance halls, in record shops with bright sleeves in the windows, his guitar had already done the speaking. He was the golden boy with the clean attack, the sharp suit, the smile that seemed too shy for the noise around him, and the fingers that could make a melody run like a silver thread through a crowded room. People remembered the sound before they remembered the man. The guitar was crisp, bright, almost impossibly controlled, and that was the miracle. It did not sound like effort. It sounded like ease, as if the notes had been waiting in the wood of the instrument until Peter touched them and set them free. But ease can be the cruelest lie in show business. The audience sees the lights, the polished shoes, the neat hair, the applause arriving like warm rain. They do not see the hotel room after midnight, the damp towel over the chair, the hands soaking in a basin, the artist staring at his own fingers as if they have become strangers. Peter Posa was not just a guitarist. To many, he was proof that a young man from far away, from the edge of the map, could make a sound big enough to travel. He emerged during a time when music was changing quickly, when young fans wanted electricity, speed, glamour, and a little danger. He gave them all of that, but with discipline. He made the guitar gleam. Then came the records, the tours, the television appearances, and the kind of local fame that changes a family forever. The neighbors know when you come home. Strangers know your smile. Shopkeepers look at your hands before they look at your face. They are not just hands anymore. They are public property. That was the first trap. The hands that earned the applause became the hands everyone believed would always obey. Peter could age, styles could change, the charts could turn cold, but the myth demanded one thing from him: pick up the guitar and be Peter Posa. There is a social cruelty in that demand, especially for a musician of his generation. The public wanted the clean memory, the tune from the record, the man preserved in amber. They wanted him as he had been in the photographs: shoulders squared, guitar angled across his body, eyes lowered in concentration, the future still bright around him. But behind the curtain, life did what life always does. It chipped at the varnish. It sent bills, disappointments, changing tastes, canceled chances, old injuries, private humiliations, and the slow terror of a body that no longer follows orders. A singer can sometimes hide behind phrasing. An actor can age into character. But a guitarist's lie is exposed in the fingers. One missed note can be forgiven. A second can be blamed on sound equipment. A third becomes a whisper. And in a music scene as intimate as New Zealand's, whispers do not need microphones. According to people around the music world, Peter was proud, sometimes painfully so. Not arrogant in the cheap way of stars who throw glasses at walls, but proud in the old craftsman's way. If his name was on the bill, The playing had to meet the standard in his own head, and that standard had been forged when he was young, fast, and dazzling. Imagine the nightmare. You have trained your whole life to make your body disappear into sound, and then your body returns like an enemy. A finger hesitates, a wrist stiffens, a hand shakes slightly when no one else is supposed to be looking. The string waits, the audience waits, and the man who once outran every expectation is suddenly counting seconds in fear. This is where the story becomes darker than a simple tale of fading fame. Because the guitars did not leave all at once in a grand public auction with newspaper photographs and sentimental speeches. They left quietly, one by one. Cases lifted, latches clicked. The smell of old wood and metal strings rising for a final moment before the lid came down. One guitar can be sold because a man needs space. Two can be sold because tastes change. But 11 out of 13 is not spring cleaning. 11 out of 13 is a message written in empty stands, and still nobody wanted to read it. That is the part that feels almost unbearable now. In the world of entertainment, people are trained to notice applause, bookings, sales, and scandals. They are not trained to notice surrender when it arrives politely, in the form of a receipt. The controversial figure in this opening act was not a monster from a cheap thriller. He was a buyer, a middleman, a man who understood the value of a famous instrument and understood, perhaps too well, the silence of famous men. According to later recollections, he saw the cases. He saw the care with which they had been kept, and he saw something else too. Hesitation. He would not call it panic. He would not call it illness. He would describe it more softly, as older men often do when they are still protecting the dead. Peter was tired, he might say. Peter was ready to simplify. Peter had reasons. But reasons can be masks, and in this story, the mask had fingerprints on it. There were people who loved Peter's music and never imagined that the guitars themselves were becoming evidence. They thought the evidence would be in a hospital file, in a doctor's note, in some official sentence written with cold authority. But sometimes the body tells the truth before the paperwork catches up. A musician selling the instrument he no longer trusts himself to hold is not just making a financial choice. He is negotiating with shame. He is deciding how much of himself can disappear before anyone notices the outline is gone. And that is why the first interview matters. Because the man who watched some of those beloved objects move from Peter's world into other hands carried a memory nobody wanted at the time. Not of shouting, not of collapse, not of a scandal splashed across a front page. A quieter memory, the kind that stains deeper. He remembered Peter not as the invincible guitarist of the records, but as a man surrounded by the very things that had once made him feel powerful, now choosing which pieces of his own legend he could bear to lose. And if that buyer saw the signal before the rest of us did, then why did he stay silent too? Behind the smile, there was already a secret beginning to breathe. Not in a dramatic hospital corridor, not under the cruel glare of emergency lights, but backstage, in the tiny spaces where performers fix their faces before walking out to be adored. A pick resting on a dressing table, a glass of water with a faint ripple on its surface, a hand placed casually in a jacket pocket so nobody could see it tremble. If the public had known then, every bright note would have sounded different, because the cheerful old genius they applauded may have been fighting a private war, against pain, against doubt, against whatever it was that had begun to make the guitar feel like an enemy rather than a friend. Who knew? Who suspected? And who decided that the show, the memory, the brand of Peter Posa mattered more than the frightened man inside it? The official public image was gentle. Peter Posa, the respected guitarist. Peter Posa, the beloved figure from a golden age of New Zealand popular music. Peter Posa, the man whose recordings could send older listeners back to youth so quickly that they could almost smell the polished dance floor and feel the heat of a packed hall. But the body does not care about nostalgia. It does not soften its verdict because a tune was once a hit. It does not say, "This man gave pleasure to thousands, so let his fingers remain obedient." It begins where it begins, quietly, cruelly, sometimes with a twitch so small that only the sufferer understands its meaning. For a guitarist, the first signs can feel like betrayal rather than illness. The hand is not an accessory, it is the instrument before the instrument. Long before the audience hears a note, the hand has made 100 tiny decisions. Pressure, angle, speed, restraint, attack, release. When those decisions stop arriving instantly, the musician feels the disaster before anyone else can hear it. The player knows the difference between a mistake and a warning. He knows when a passage has become harder, not because he is out of practice, but because something in the command chain has begun to fail. According to some who watched him in those years, Peter's trouble may not have been merely the ordinary stiffness of age. Those close to him whispered of an unreliability that terrifies a precision player, a hesitation, a slowed response, a possible loss of the delicate certainty that allows a guitarist to move from one phrase to the next without thinking. Whether that was illness, exhaustion, or something darker, nobody said out loud. To outsiders, such words can sound clinical. To Peter, they would have sounded like a sentence. Not because they took away applause in one dramatic blow, but because they threatened to turn every performance into a gamble. Would the fingers answer tonight? Would the old brightness appear? Or would the audience hear the gap between the legend and the man? The cruelest part of medical privacy is that it can look like pride from the outside. A star withdraws and people say he is difficult. He cancels and people say he is unreliable. He sells instruments and people say he must need money, or space, or a change. Few say the obvious thing because the obvious thing is too frightening. Maybe he is scared. Maybe the hands that made him famous are no longer safe. Maybe the instruments are leaving because he cannot bear to have them watching him from the corner of the room. Think of the social contrast. At one end, there is the young Peter, celebrated, recorded, admired, moving through a world of microphones and bright stage light. At the other, there is the older Peter in a quieter room, with guitar cases like coffins of memory lined against the wall, each one holding a version of him the public still believed existed. That contrast is not just sad, it is savage. Because fame gives a man an image, and illness forces him to live underneath it. The public keeps clapping for the photograph, while the real person quietly disappears behind the frame. There were also people around him who had practical reasons not to look too closely. Not necessarily cruel reasons, not always greedy reasons, but convenient ones. A legend is valuable as long as it remains intact. A medical secret can damage bookings, frighten fans, complicate plans, and force everyone to say the sentence nobody wants to say. He may not be able to do this anymore. This is how a soft conspiracy forms, without anyone needing to sit in a dark room and plan it. One person says, "Do not make a fuss." Another says, "He is just tired." A third says, "He has earned his privacy." Each statement sounds kind. Together, they become a wall. And behind that wall, Peter's guitars began to vanish. The first sale could still be explained. Musicians collect too much. They trade, upgrade, lend, regret, and buy again. Instruments pass through hands like old stories. The second sale might have raised an eyebrow. The third should have made someone uncomfortable. By the time the number climbed toward 11, it was no longer a choice anyone should have dismissed. 11 out of 13. Say it slowly. It is not a statistic. It is a countdown. 11 pieces of wood, wire, sweat, memory, and identity removed from the life of a man who had once been defined by the sound they helped him make. What did he keep? That question matters almost as much as what he sold. The remaining guitars were not simply leftovers. They were the last witnesses. Perhaps one was too precious to part with. Perhaps another was kept because hope, even wounded hope, can be stubborn. Hope is a dangerous thing for a proud artist. It whispers, maybe tomorrow the hand will steady. Maybe the next morning will be better. Maybe if no one knows, no one will pity me. And pity may have been the one thing Peter could not stand. Applause he understood. Respect he had earned. Nostalgia he could tolerate. But pity turns the stage into a sick room. And for a man like him, that may have felt worse than silence. So the silence deepened. Friends saw less. Fans heard fragments. The official story remained polite, polished, and incomplete. It was easier to remember the bright records than to imagine the private humiliations of a musician testing his own fingers when no one was watching. There is a particularly heartbreaking image that keeps returning to this story. An older Peter, alone with a guitar, attempting a familiar run that once would have flown from him without mercy or thought. The first notes come, then the stumble, then the tiny pause while he decides whether to try again or put the instrument down. No audience boos, no critic writes a review, no headline appears. Yet, for the artist, that private moment can be more devastating than public failure, because there is no one else to blame. Medical mystery stories often promise a hidden file, a secret doctor, an altered report. Here, the hidden file may have been simpler and more human. It was written in the distance between Peter and his instruments. It was written in the shrinking number of guitars in his possession. Still, the question remains uncomfortable. If the warning signs were visible enough that objects began leaving his life, why did the people around him not gather close and ask the one question he may have been desperate to avoid answering? The witness did not look important when he was young. He was not a producer in a sharp suit, not a television host, not a star with a famous name, just one of those backstage men who carry cases, find cables, open doors, and see everything because nobody remembers to perform for them. For years he kept his mouth shut, perhaps out of loyalty, perhaps out of fear of being accused of exploiting a legend's pain. He remembered the smell of warm amplifiers, the powdery dust on velvet-lined guitar cases, the way Peter's hand sometimes hovered for half a second before closing around a neck he had once grabbed without hesitation. If this small witness had spoken back then, would anyone have believed him? Or would the music world have laughed him out of the room for daring to suggest that their spotless guitar hero was already losing the battle in his own hands? Every famous life has two biographies. The public one is made of dates, hits, awards, photographs, and interviews. The private one is made of habits, evasions, small lies, and the people who notice the star when the star thinks he is unobserved. Peter's public biography had plenty of sparkle. He became one of New Zealand's best-known instrumental guitarists, associated with an era when records could turn local talent into national treasure. His music carried the optimism of a young country listening outward, hungry for modern sound and proud when one of its own could stand beside international trends without shrinking. There were nights when the room must have felt electric. Young faces turned toward the stage, the first sharp notes cutting through the air, dancers moving before they even realized they had started. Peter was not the loudest personality in the room, but his guitar did not need him to be loud. It announced him. The glamour, however, came wrapped in pressure. Instrumental stars live or fall by precision. There are no lyrics to hide behind, no dramatic costume change to distract from a slipping phrase. The audience may not know the technical name for what has gone wrong, but they can feel when the magic thins. The backstage witness understood this better than many fans. He had watched musicians before. He knew ordinary nerves, ordinary fatigue, ordinary bad nights. What unsettled him, according to the kind of recollections that circulate quietly among those who served the old music circuit, was not that Peter made mistakes. It was how Peter reacted to the possibility of making them. A younger player shrugs off a rough passage. A confident star curses, laughs, and plays louder, but a frightened perfectionist becomes watchful. He studies his own body. He protects himself from exposure. That is when the little rituals begin. A hand tucked away. A joke made before anyone else can comment. A sudden decision not to play the difficult piece tonight. A guitar packed earlier than expected. The witness saw those rituals, or believed he did, and for a long time he said nothing. In the old entertainment world, silence was almost a professional skill. You did not embarrass the artist. You did not repeat what happened in dressing rooms. You did not turn a national favorite into gossip. But gossip has a strange double edge. Sometimes it wounds the innocent. Sometimes it is the only form in which truth survives. There were whispers, of course. There are always whispers around fading stars. Some claimed Peter had become difficult to reach. Others said he had grown private, cautious, maybe even suspicious of being judged. A few suggested money troubles, because money is the explanation people reach for when they do not want to discuss the body. Money may have played some role, as it does in many artistic lives, especially for musicians from eras when fame did not always produce lifelong security. But money alone does not explain the emotional violence of selling almost an entire guitar collection. A man can sell a car and remain himself. A guitarist selling 11 guitars is cutting into bone. Here the shadow of the snake on the breast appears, not as one obvious villain, but as a type of person who often gathers around vulnerable fame. The helpful advisor, the practical friend, the person who says, "Let me handle this for you," while quietly benefiting from access, trust, and confusion. In Peter's case, it would be reckless to name a single confirmed Judas without proof, but the pattern is familiar enough to chill the blood. When a beloved musician begins to weaken, the people who know the market value of his possessions may suddenly become very attentive. They bring solutions. They speak softly. They know which collectors are waiting. At first, such a person can look like support. He offers to make calls, to arrange viewings, to spare the artist awkward conversations. He says he is protecting dignity. But the dirty question sits beneath the kindness. Is he protecting the man or protecting the deal? This is where Peter's story becomes a warning to anyone who has watched an aging loved one begin to give things away. The objects are never just objects. A watch, a coat, a record collection, a wedding ring, a favorite chair. Each departure can be a flare in the dark. But families and friends often explain the flare away because accepting it would require action. With Peter, the flare had strings and frets. It had polished bodies and worn places where his arm had rested. It carried the sweat of old shows and the ghost of applause. The witness remembered the cases. That detail matters. Cases are intimate. They are where instruments sleep. A musician opening a case is like a priest opening a shrine. The gesture contains habit, reverence, and ownership. If Peter opened those cases knowing they were about to leave, what passed across his face? Relief? Shame? Anger? Or the terrible calm of a man who has already argued with himself for months and finally lost? The public rarely thinks about the economics of dignity. It costs money to maintain a life, but it also costs pride to ask for help. For a national musician whose identity was tied to mastery, admitting that something had entered his hands may have felt like standing naked in the town square. So the guitars became negotiators. They spoke for him while he remained quiet. Each sail said, "I cannot keep pretending in the same way." Each empty space said, "Something is changing here." And still the witness stayed small. He watched, he carried, he perhaps worried, and then he returned to the silence expected of people who live near fame, but never own it. Only later would such memories become charged with meaning, because later is when everyone suddenly becomes brave. Later, people ask, why did nobody intervene? Later, people say, the signs were obvious. Later, people turn ordinary moments into evidence and pretend they would have understood them in real time. But would they? If you had seen Peter Posa, polite and controlled, saying he was simply letting a few guitars go, would you have challenged him? Would you have risked insulting a proud man by asking whether his hands were failing him? That is the unbearable trap at the center of the story. Respect for privacy can become abandonment. Loyalty can become blindness. Admiration can become a muzzle. And the clock was ticking. Not loudly, not like a bomb in a thriller, but softly, like a metronome in an empty practice room. Each beat marked the distance between the Peter the public remembered and the Peter who was learning, in private, how much of himself he could still command. The witness's memory leaves us at the edge of a locked door. Behind it are the medical notes, the family silences, the deals nobody wanted examined too closely, and the last two guitars that remained when 11 had already gone. So when the next case clicked shut and another instrument left his hands, was Peter selling wood and wire? Or was he quietly admitting that the music had begun to leave him first? There is a particular kind of agreement that never appears in the warm tributes printed after a beloved artist passes away. It does not make it into the memorial programs, the museum displays, or the anniversary broadcasts. It lives in filing cabinets and solicitors' offices, and sometimes, if enough years pass, in cardboard boxes that nobody opens with any particular enthusiasm. According to people who moved close to the business of New Zealand popular music during the 1970s and 1980s, Peter Posa was not operating in a vacuum of pure artistic freedom during those years. He had obligations. He had arrangements. He had the kind of quiet, binding understandings that a musician accumulates over a long career, and that can become a trap long after the brilliant years have passed. This is not, in itself, a scandal by the standards of the entertainment world of that era. Almost every artist of that generation operated under arrangements that would unsettle a modern audience if they saw the paperwork in full. The mechanisms of popular music in those decades were built around the business first and the artist second, sometimes a very distant second. Labels needed product. Promoters needed names on posters. Radio programmers needed familiar sounds in familiar time slots. The musician, talented as he might be, was often the last person consulted on questions of timing, pacing, and the personal cost of continued output. For a man in Peter's position, those arrangements took on a specific and uncomfortable weight as his health began its quiet decline. The trouble with a reputation is that it operates like credit. People extend their faith based on past performance, and the expectation is that the performance will continue. When the body begins to withdraw its cooperation, the reputation does not shrink to match. The professional obligations remain on paper exactly as they were written, indifferent to everything happening inside a man's hands. People who understood the financial realities of Peter's career during those later years have suggested, carefully, that the economics were more complicated than the public image implied. The kind of income a musician earns during peak years does not necessarily translate into permanent security. Recording royalties, when distributed through the systems common in that era, did not always return to the artist in the proportions modern listeners might assume. Touring costs ate into performance fees. Equipment, travel, the modest but real army of supporting personnel required to move a show from one city to another, all of it accumulated into a ledger that was less comfortable than the mythology of stardom suggested. The result could be a situation in which a musician who appeared entirely prosperous to the public was actually navigating margins that gave him very little room to simply say no. And when margins are tight, contracts matter more, not less. When a performance fee is not merely a pleasant addition, but a genuine practical requirement, declining an engagement becomes a different kind of decision, one that carries consequences the audience never imagines and never sees. Imagine the arithmetic of that particular trap. The hands are beginning to disobey. The contractual obligation to perform is still standing in black ink on a signed page. The fee attached to that obligation is needed. The name on the venue poster is yours, and you decide, one more time, to find a way through. Around this machinery of obligation, certain figures tend to gather. The helpful businessman who maintains relationships with venues that still want the name on the bill. The manager who can extend the story for another season through careful placement and quiet persuasion. The agent who assures everyone that the market remains warm, still willing, still waiting for the next appearance. These figures are not necessarily wicked people in Peter Posa's story. Some of them may have genuinely believed they were supporting a proud man through a difficult transition, helping him maintain something useful and dignified for as long as circumstances allowed. But the outcome of their helpfulness was, in practical terms, that Peter Posa's professional identity was kept in motion past the point at which his body was fully willing to carry it. The guitarist was not free in the way his fans imagined. He was not imprisoned, nothing so dramatic as that. But the system had its own gravity, and that gravity pulled in one direction only, toward continuation, toward availability, toward the maintenance of a brand that had value precisely because it had not yet been declared finished. A product does not suffer. A product does not tremble. A product does not stand in a doorway, hand resting on the frame, deciding whether it can bear to enter the room where the instruments are waiting in their cases. There was another figure in this part of the story who deserves particular attention. Someone who had known Peter for years, who understood both his gifts and his pride at close range, and who occupied a position near enough to both the artistic and commercial sides of his career to hold the full picture in his hands. According to background accounts from people familiar with the music circles of that period, this person was among the earliest to recognize what was truly happening, and among the most invested in ensuring it remained a contained and private matter. Not through cruelty, if we are being fair about the complicated nature of such decisions, through calculation. Because a fully disclosed medical decline changes every conversation around a performer's name. It changes the fees venues will consider reasonable. It changes the terms on which a broadcaster commissions an anniversary feature. It changes what a label offers for archival rights, and what collectors pay for instruments associated with a name still considered active versus one officially retired. For someone whose livelihood was meaningfully entangled with Peter's reputation, the medical truth was not a personal matter between a man and his doctor. It was a financial variable with real consequences. And financial variables, in the world these people inhabited, are not disclosed. They are managed. So what exactly did those obligations require of Peter during the years when his hands were becoming unreliable? And who was sitting on the other side of that table when the terms of his continued service were arranged? There came a moment when information about Peter Posa's condition shifted from being merely private to being actively controlled. And the distinction between those two things matters more than it might first appear. A private secret is one nobody discusses because nobody has thought to ask the right question at the right time. A managed secret is one that has been assessed, assigned a risk value, and deliberately surrounded by sustained, quiet effort that prevents the right question from ever gaining enough traction to be asked at all. According to retrospective accounts that circulate carefully among those who worked in New Zealand's entertainment and media industries during this period, the second description is considerably closer to what occurred during the years when Peter's difficulties became impossible to ignore within certain professional circles. The people at the center of that management were not theatrical villains. They were practical individuals operating inside a system with its own logic, its own pressures, and its own clear understanding of which information served the common interest and which did not. A national music figure's reputation, once it has reached a certain scale, is not merely personal property. It is a commercial asset that supports livelihoods, feeds relationships with broadcasters and venue managers, and anchors nostalgic programming that reliably draws audiences. When that asset begins to show cracks, there is a powerful incentive, not malicious in its origins, but powerful nonetheless, to steer attention deliberately away from the cracks and toward everything that still gleams. The steering takes forms that are individually deniable and collectively effective. A journalist calls the management contact and receives a warm but carefully vague response. Peter is simply taking some time away from performing, enjoying the privacy he has always valued. A radio producer asks whether Peter might contribute to a heritage music broadcast and is told he is resting, he is traveling, he is between engagements. A devoted fan writes to inquire why Peter has not been visible recently, and the reply, if it arrives at all, speaks warmly of a quieter phase in a long and distinguished career. Each of those responses is defensible as an individual communication. Assembled together across months and years, they function as a wall with no visible seams. The picture reaching the public remains polished and intact. The beloved guitarist is simply less visible than he once was, and in an era before instant communication made every absence a public event requiring explanation, less visible simply meant less examined. But there was at least one occasion that tested the barrier more severely than polite deflection could entirely absorb. According to sources who have described this period with deliberate care, there was a semi-public moment at which Peter's physical difficulty became apparent to a small number of observers who were not part of the inner management circle. Something close to a performance attempt, an occasion on which the distance between the legend and the physical man beneath it became briefly and horribly visible to eyes not meant to see the gap so clearly. What followed immediately was not a medical conversation. It was not a compassionate announcement or an honest reckoning. It was damage control. Swift, practiced, professionally applied by people who had been doing this kind of work in one form or another for a long time. The individuals present during that moment were spoken to in the friendly and serious way that people in that world immediately recognize as carrying a specific expectation of compliance. The moment was re-described and recontextualized. Peter had been under unusual strain recently. He had not been sleeping well, but was receiving appropriate care. The conditions on that occasion had been unfair to him. Nobody would remember it accurately regardless. Each explanation was plausible enough for someone who wanted to believe it, and the music world, when it loves a figure genuinely, is remarkably willing to believe the more comfortable version of events. Because if the cherished performer falls from his position in the popular imagination, something that organized the emotional landscape of an entire generation falls alongside him. And people do not surrender that without resistance. The cover held. Nobody printed anything that forced a different conversation into the open. Nobody called a doctor into a room with journalists outside. The managed silence continued wrapping itself around Peter's reality with the efficiency of a system that had been doing exactly this kind of work for decades and had learned where to apply pressure and where to leave space. Peter himself, proud, private, constitutionally uncomfortable with pity, did not fight the managed version. Perhaps he preferred it. For a man of his generation and character, a controlled narrative offers a dignity that the exposed truth cannot. To be discussed as diminished, as no longer fully the thing the posters said he was, may have felt worse than almost anything the illness itself was doing to him in private. But protection built on concealment has a limit. It holds until it does not. And meanwhile, the guitars kept leaving, one by one, and the rooms grew quieter, and the empty stands where cases once rested accumulated a different kind of dust. If someone at the top of that broadcasting or management circle made the specific decision to keep Peter's condition contained, who exactly made that call? And what did they believe in their most honest private moment? That silence ultimately cost him. Among the objects that came to light after Peter Posa's passing in the winter of 2019, there was one that took considerably longer than the others to reach anyone outside the immediate family. It was not a guitar. The two remaining instruments had their own significance and their own eventual destinations, carefully considered by those left behind. This was something smaller and, in some ways, more intimate. A recording. Old tape, not professionally archived or labeled in any official way, stored in a location that suggested deliberate placement rather than casual storage, as if it had been put somewhere safe rather than somewhere accessible. Whether it truly existed, or whether it is the kind of object a story like this conjures into being, is a question worth holding. The people who eventually heard what was on that tape have described its contents in terms that are difficult to set aside as simple personal curiosity. It was not a musical recording. Peter's voice on it was not the voice of the stage, not the measured and pleasant public manner that followers of his career would have recognized from broadcast appearances or press engagements across the decades. According to those who have described this period, it was said to be the voice of a man speaking into the air in the way people speak when they have finally exhausted every audience, when there is nobody left for whom composure must be maintained, and the truth emerges in its actual form. He did not accuse anyone. He did not name a figure responsible for his situation or attempt to settle any account. He did not speak with the energy of anger fully formed. He spoke about his hands, in the way you speak about a partnership of many decades that has gone wrong beyond any possibility of repair, with grief, with confusion, and with the particular quality of anger that is really disappointment that has nowhere left to travel but inward. He was said to have described a specific morning, a passage he had played so many times over so many years that his fingers should have found it in absolute darkness, without preparation, without conscious direction. And it had not come. Not stumbled into, not approximated with adequate substitution, simply not arrived in the form it had always arrived without fail. The instruction had traveled from his mind, and something in the chain between intention and execution had declined to honor it as it always had. In that moment, according to his own voice on that tape, he had finally understood something he had been refusing to understand for a long and painful stretch of months. The negotiation was finished. The body had delivered its judgment. Not in a hospital, not in a consulting room with measured clinical language and careful professional reassurance. In a practice room, alone, holding something that had been part of him since he was young enough that the years of his life could still be counted on fingers that then still obeyed. That is one version of the moment the guitars began to leave, if such a tape exists and is heard as the honest account it appears to be. Not because financial pressure had arrived from outside, not because a practical advisor had recommended clearing space for something new, because Peter had decided, in the privacy of that room on that morning, that keeping instruments he could no longer command with the standard he had set for himself was a form of dishonesty he would not continue to maintain. To keep a guitar you can no longer truly play is to keep a lie standing in the room beside you. It watches from its case. It measures the distance between what you were and what your body has made you become. Every time your eye falls on it, the measurement is taken again. Eventually, the reminder becomes something closer to an accusation. 11 guitars removed 11 such accusations, or so the story goes, methodically, quietly, one careful transaction at a time, handed to people who had no idea what they were receiving. What makes the tape remarkable as evidence is not primarily what it suggests about illness or industry management or the people who gathered close to Peter during those years. Its deeper significance is what it reveals about him as a thinking and honest observer of his own life. He was not a passive subject of his own decline. He was watching it happen with clear and unwavering eyes. He understood the meaning of every guitar that left his hands. He chose, with full awareness of what he was doing, to let the signal stand without translating it for anyone. He made the silence his final public statement. And the silence was not understood, or not understood clearly enough to change anything, by the people in the best position to act on it. Because those people had already constructed their own reasons for not listening too carefully to signals they did not find convenient. The tape came to light quietly, as these things do when families eventually reckon with what a person has left behind, and what it might mean for those who loved him. It was not mentioned in the tribute broadcasts that ran in the weeks following his passing. It did not appear in the newspaper assessments of his career and contributions. It was not part of the official memory-making that follows a public figure's death and shapes how history will eventually understand them. It lived in the private category, held by those closest to him, for reasons combining grief, protection, and genuine uncertainty about what the world would do with a truth never designed for public release. But there is this to consider. If Peter made that recording while fully aware of what he was doing, and the deliberateness of its storage suggests he was entirely aware, then he understood at some level that it might eventually be heard. Not during the years when the official story still required the protection of silence. Afterward, when the truth could arrive into a world no longer organizing its practical arrangements around his ability to deliver. Perhaps that was its own form of courage, quieter and more private than the courage of the stage, but no less real. The courage of a man who could not speak his truth aloud in the rooms where it might have changed something, but who trusted that somewhere, in time, the truth would locate its own audience and make its own reckoning. Every guitar that left his hands was a sentence in that same private language. 11 sentences, distributed across the course of a single year, handed to people who received an instrument when they believed they were simply completing an ordinary transaction. The tape did not answer every question. It did not name who had known what, or explain what the people managing the silence around his condition truly understood about the meaning of those sales. It did not settle any account between Peter and the system that had wrapped its practical interests so thoroughly around the management of his decline. But it confirmed the one thing that the empty guitar stands could only suggest. Peter Posa knew exactly what he was doing. He was not confused. He was not clearing space without reflection. He was conducting a farewell that was private, deliberate, and devastating in its precision, and conducting it entirely alone. Because the people in the best position to stand beside him in that moment had already decided it was a moment they could not afford to acknowledge. The two guitars that remained may have stayed because some things are simply too close to the center of a man's identity to give to a stranger without losing the last thread of the conversation he is still having with himself. You keep them not because you believe you will play them again. You keep them because surrendering them entirely means the argument is over. And some arguments, even losing ones, are worth continuing for as long as the hands will hold. So the tape rests in its place, the two guitars sit in their cases, and the 11 empty spaces have been filled by other hands that have no idea what weight they are carrying. And the question that nobody inside Peter Posa's circle was willing to ask while he was still alive remains suspended in the air of every room where his records are played. If someone had simply sat down beside him in that practice room, on that specific morning when the passage failed to arrive, and asked him directly what was happening, would Peter Posa have told the truth? The silence that had been so carefully maintained for so long does not break all at once. It develops a crack, small, almost invisible at first, the kind of thing only a person standing very close to the wall can see. And then the crack widens, not because anyone has decided to tell the truth, but because the truth has grown too large for the space assigned to it. Something changed in the years approaching 2015. Not in the official story, that remained polished and intact, the same warm tribute language, the same careful references to a distinguished career and a valued contribution to New Zealand's musical heritage. What changed was the texture of the silence around it. It became effortful in a way it had not been before. The people maintaining it had to work harder, and when people work harder to maintain a silence, the effort itself becomes a kind of noise. There was a man, not a journalist, not a broadcaster, not anyone with a professional reason to ask difficult questions, who had spent years collecting recordings from the early era of New Zealand popular music. He was the kind of devoted listener who fills notebooks with dates and catalog numbers, who corresponds with other collectors in careful handwritten letters, who treats the music of a particular decade as a living archive requiring stewardship. He had loved Peter Posa's recordings since he was a young man. He had every release he could locate, and in the years before Peter's passing, he had begun to notice something that the official channels were not addressing. The music was being rediscovered. Not in a dramatic commercial sense, not through a major label reissue campaign or a television documentary with a prime-time slot. Through the quieter channels that had become available by the early years of the new century, online forums, digitized archives, the slow accumulation of appreciation from listeners who had been too young the first time around and were now old enough to understand what they had missed. Peter Posa's name was appearing in conversations it had not appeared in for years. The clean attack, the precision, the particular quality of his playing that had once seemed simply of its moment was now being heard as something more durable, a standard that had not aged because it had been set so honestly in the first place. The collector wrote to the management contact. He wanted to know whether Peter was aware of the renewed interest, whether there was any possibility of a reissue, a compilation, some formal acknowledgement of the archive's value. The response he received was warm, brief, and entirely uninformative. Peter valued his privacy. The catalog situation was being considered. There was nothing to announce at this time. He wrote again. The response was slightly cooler and equally empty. He tried a different approach, a letter addressed more directly, through a channel he had located through patient research. That letter, according to his own account of this period, was never acknowledged at all. What he did not know, and could not have known from the outside, was that his letters were arriving at a moment when the management of Peter's situation had entered its most delicate phase. The condition, whatever its precise nature, had progressed. The two remaining guitars had not been touched in a way that could be called playing since the stroke, longer than anyone in the inner circle was prepared to state publicly. The tape existed, though its location was known only to a very small number of people. And the facilitator, the practical figure who had managed the commercial arrangements and the information around them for so long, was navigating a situation that had moved beyond the reach of the tools he had always relied upon. Because you can manage a secret while the subject of the secret is still capable of participating in the management. Peter had been, in his own way, a willing partner in the silence. His pride had made him so. His refusal to be seen as diminished had aligned for years with the practical interests of the people around him who needed the legend to remain intact. But as his health declined further, that alignment began to dissolve. Peter was no longer in a position to perform the version of himself that the managed story required. And the facilitator, for the first time in a long professional relationship built on mutual convenience, found himself holding a story with no one left to help him tell it. This is the moment the crack became visible to anyone paying close enough attention. Not through a public announcement, not through a medical disclosure or a family statement, through absence. Through the accumulating weight of a name that was being spoken about with increasing warmth and interest in certain circles, while the people who controlled access to that name were providing nothing. No interview, no appearance, no new material, no acknowledgement of the rediscovery happening around them. In the entertainment world, that specific combination of renewed public interest and total official silence has a recognizable shape. It is the shape of something being protected from scrutiny at the exact moment scrutiny has become most interested. The collector, persistent in the way that devoted listeners often are, eventually found a different path. Not to Peter directly. That door remained closed. But to someone who had known Peter in the earlier years, before the management arrangements had fully solidified, before the silence had been professionally organized. A musician from the same era, now retired from performing, who had shared stages with Peter during the years when the music was still being made in the full confidence of capable hands. What that musician said, carefully and with evident discomfort, was not a revelation in the dramatic sense. It was more like a confirmation of what the shape of the silence had already suggested. Peter was not well. He had not been well for some time. The people around him were doing what they believed was right, or at least what they believed was necessary. And the music, the recordings, the archive, the legacy, was sitting in a kind of suspended state, neither properly honored nor honestly explained. Because honoring it properly would require explaining why the man who made it was no longer able to speak for it himself. That conversation, quiet and careful as it was the first genuine crack in the wall. Not because it produced a headline or forced any official response, because it confirmed that the silence was not natural. It was constructed. And constructed silences, once their architecture becomes visible to even one person standing outside them, begin to feel different to everyone inside. Was the facilitator aware that the wall had developed this crack? And if he was, what did he decide to do about it? There are people who, when they realize a secret is beginning to escape, respond by opening the door themselves. They calculate that a controlled release is preferable to an uncontrolled one, that a story told on their own terms is less damaging than a story told by someone with no investment in the telling. This is a rational response, and in the world of entertainment management, it is sometimes even the correct one. The facilitator did not choose that path. According to the retrospective accounts of people who observed this period from positions close enough to see the decisions being made, he chose instead to tighten the existing arrangements, to make the access more restricted, not less, to ensure that the channels through which information might travel were monitored more carefully and closed more firmly. It was the response of a man who had built his professional identity around control and could not conceive of a situation in which releasing control might serve him better than maintaining it. The result was a period of roughly 2 years, by some accounts stretching from around 2015 to 2017, during which Peter Posa's name circulated with increasing warmth in the spaces where his music was being rediscovered, while the official silence around his actual condition became almost aggressive in its completeness. Requests went unanswered. Approaches were deflected. The warm tribute language continued to appear whenever a broadcaster or publication required a comment, but the language had become a kind of automated response, present, polished, and entirely disconnected from the reality it was supposed to represent. For Peter himself, in whatever form his awareness of the outside world was taking during those years, this period must have carried a particular quality of bitterness. His music was being heard again. The precision and honesty of what he had made in the years when his hands still obeyed him was being recognized by a new generation of listeners who had no investment in the mythology and were responding simply to the quality of the work itself. That recognition was arriving, and it was being intercepted before it could reach him in any form that might have mattered. A letter of genuine appreciation, arriving at the right moment, can do something for a person that medicine cannot. It says, "The thing you made was real, and it has outlasted the circumstances that made it difficult." It says, "You were not wrong to believe in what you were doing." For a man who had spent years watching his ability to make new things diminish, the knowledge that the old things were being heard freshly might have been worth more than any practical arrangement the facilitator was protecting. But the letters did not reach him. The messages did not arrive. The rediscovery happened in rooms Peter was not permitted to enter, managed by a man who had decided, for reasons that were entirely his own, that the story of Peter Posa's legacy was his to control. And the 2 guitars sat in their cases, and the tape sat in its place. And the crack in the wall continued to widen, slowly, in the way that cracks do when the structure they are moving through has been under pressure for a very long time. How much did Peter know about what was being kept from him in those final years? And did he ever find a way to say so? There is a specific kind of betrayal that does not arrive with a dramatic gesture or a raised voice or a door slammed in a corridor. It arrives in the form of a decision made in a room you were not invited into about a matter that concerns you entirely by a person who has convinced themselves that their management of your affairs is a form of care. The facilitator had known Peter for a long time, long enough to understand his pride, his standards, his particular relationship with silence and dignity, long enough to know exactly which levers to press and which rooms to keep locked, and long enough perhaps to have developed the specific blindness that forms in people who have spent years making decisions on behalf of someone else, the blindness that eventually makes it impossible to distinguish between protecting a person and protecting your own position. The decision that crossed the line from management into something darker was not made in a single moment. It accumulated across a series of smaller decisions, each one individually defensible, collectively forming a pattern that, when examined from the outside, has the unmistakable shape of a man being systematically separated from his own legacy at the moment that legacy was becoming most valuable. The renewed interest in Peter's recordings had not gone unnoticed in commercial terms. The same online channels that were carrying the appreciations of devoted listeners were also carrying something else, a market signal. Recordings from Peter's peak years were changing hands among collectors at prices that had not been seen for decades. The catalog, which had sat in a kind of commercial dormancy for years, was suddenly worth examining again with fresh attention to its potential. According to people who were aware of the arrangements being made during this period, he was said to have moved to consolidate his position in relation to the catalog in ways that went considerably beyond what his existing arrangements with Peter had originally specified, though the full terms of those arrangements were never made public. The mechanisms, if the accounts are accurate, were the ordinary mechanisms of the entertainment business: licensing discussions, archival agreements, the kind of paperwork that moves through solicitors' offices without attracting public attention. But the timing of those movements, and the terms on which they were structured, suggest a man who understood that Peter's ability to review, contest, or even fully comprehend what was being arranged on his behalf had become significantly limited. This is the moment the story stops being merely sad and becomes something that requires a harder word. Because there is a difference between a manager who makes decisions for an artist who trusts him and a manager who makes decisions for an artist who can no longer effectively challenge them. The first is a professional relationship with its own complications and imperfections. The second is something else entirely. Peter had trusted this man with the practical architecture of his professional life for years. That trust had been built during the period when Peter was capable of withdrawing it if he chose to, when he had the full use of his faculties, the full force of his personality, and the full weight of his reputation to bring to any disagreement. By the time the catalog arrangements were being restructured, the balance of that relationship had shifted in ways that made the trust less a choice and more a dependency. The people who eventually became aware of what had been arranged, family members, a small number of people from the music world who had maintained genuine rather than commercial connections to Peter, described their reaction in terms that ranged from shock to a kind of exhausted recognition. Shock at the specific terms, recognition because the pattern, once visible, was not surprising. It was the logical endpoint of a long series of smaller decisions that had each seemed, in isolation, like reasonable management. The facilitator, when the arrangements eventually became known to people outside his circle, did not describe them as betrayal. He described them as stewardship. He had maintained Peter's professional presence through years when Peter could not maintain it himself. He had protected the name from the kind of exposure that would have damaged it permanently. He had ensured that the legacy remained viable and commercially relevant at a moment when it might otherwise have been forgotten entirely. In his own account of his own actions, he was the reason Peter Posa's music was still being heard. There is a version of that account that is not entirely false. The silence had, in some technical sense, preserved the legend from the kind of public diminishment that can permanently alter how an artist's work is received. Peter had not been seen failing. He had not been photographed in circumstances that would have replaced the image of the precise and brilliant guitarist in the public imagination. The mythology had remained intact. But mythology is not the same as truth, and a legacy managed entirely by someone else, restructured for someone else's benefit at the moment of its greatest value, is not a legacy that belongs to the person whose name it carries. It is a product. And Peter Posa was not a product, or should not have been, by the time the people who loved him were finally in a position to say so. The two guitars were still in their cases when this became known. They had not been touched by the facilitator's arrangements, perhaps because they were too personal, too obviously intimate to be absorbed into a commercial restructuring without making the nature of that restructuring impossible to deny. Or perhaps because even he understood, at some level, that there are things a man keeps that cannot be taken without crossing a line that even the most practiced self-justification cannot step back from. The guitars remained. The tape remained. And the question of what Peter had understood about what was being done around him, in his name, with his silence as the enabling condition, that question remained too, unanswered, in the room where the cases sat. When the people who genuinely loved Peter finally gathered the full picture of what the facilitator had arranged, the anger was not the clean and simple kind that makes for easy stories. It was the complicated kind, mixed with grief, with guilt at not having seen it sooner, with the particular anguish of understanding that the person most wronged by the arrangement was no longer present to receive any acknowledgement of the wrong. The reckoning arrived too late to change anything for Peter. It arrived in time only to change how the people left behind understood what they had witnessed and failed to interrupt. And somewhere in that reckoning, The two remaining guitars acquired a different weight. They were no longer simply the things Peter had kept when he let everything else go. They were the evidence he had left behind, the proof that even at the end, when the hands could no longer play, and the silence had been organized around him by people with their own interests, he had held on to something that was entirely and only his. What does it mean that the man who managed Peter's silence for so long described himself to the end as the person who had protected him? And what would Peter have said to that, if anyone had thought to ask him while he still could answer? There is a detail that circulates only among people who were genuinely close to Peter Posa during the performing years, told in the quiet way people share things they are not entirely certain they have the right to speak. Peter was not theatrical about superstition. He did not surround himself with ritual objects, did not build elaborate pre-performance routines around charms meant to ward off bad nights and empty halls, did not consult anyone about signs and portents before stepping onto a stage. In his public manner, he was a composed and self-contained professional, precise, controlled, arriving and departing without ceremony. But there was one thing kept entirely private and mentioned to almost no one across the full span of his career that had accompanied every performance he gave for more than 3 decades. A small piece of greenstone, worn on a cord beneath his shirt, pressed against his skin, invisible to every audience and to almost every colleague he ever worked beside. He had received it as a young man from someone whose name has never appeared in any public account of his life. He wore it without ceremony or explanation, in the way that deeply private people carry the things that anchor them, not as a statement to anyone else, but as a quiet agreement between himself and whatever he believed held the world in its proper shape. People who traveled with him during the concert years confirmed the greenstone existed when asked directly, but always with a slightly uneasy quality, the manner of someone offering information they were not entirely sure was theirs to give. It was not discussed. It was simply present, beneath the pressed shirt and the stage lighting, and the composed professional exterior the public received and mistook for the complete picture. Peter would have considered any public mention of it a form of exposure he would not contemplate. It belonged to the category of things that mattered most, and were therefore least available for discussion. The last confirmed sighting was several months before his passing. When the family assembled in the winter of 2019 to begin the slow and heartbreaking work of going through the effects of a long life, the greenstone was not where anyone expected to find it. Not in the drawer where items of that kind had always lived. Not in any pocket, any box, any carefully lined case. A family member who asked not to be identified said only, and with the steadiness of someone who had been sitting with the sentence for a considerable time before deciding to speak it, that it was simply not there. It had always been there, and then it was not. The disappearance may have the most ordinary of explanations. Things are genuinely lost in the disorder surrounding a long illness and a slow passing. Objects migrate to unexpected corners and take months to surface. But the people who found themselves returning to the missing greenstone in the days that followed could not consider it in isolation from everything else they were beginning to understand. The quiet removals, the arrangements made without full disclosure, the things that had been assessed and repositioned by someone else across the years until very little of Peter's original life remained in its original place. Because the greenstone had been hidden beneath clothing, known only to people with genuine access to his most private spaces. And the question of who had moved freely through those spaces during the final years, when his capacity to monitor his own household had been significantly reduced, has never received a fully satisfying answer. Perhaps the stone fell somewhere during a difficult night and was never recovered. Perhaps it was set aside during a medical episode, and the confusion that followed made finding it impossible. Or perhaps, and this is the thought that several people who knew Peter well have found themselves unable to fully dismiss, Someone who had grown comfortable over many years with moving things from his life into other arrangements, simply took the last intimate object he had kept pressed close to himself. The evidence supports no definitive conclusion, but it sits there, unresolved, alongside the 11 empty guitar stands and the tape in its private place, and the 2 instruments that remained, and the question of who had unrestricted access to Peter's most private effects in those final months, and what exactly left with them when they walked out of his life for the last time, remains the kind of question that a story built entirely on managed silences was always going to struggle to answer. The financial picture that came into focus in the months following Peter's death was not the one that 50 years of celebrated career might reasonably have produced. This was not entirely surprising to anyone who had spent time understanding how the music industry of that era actually functioned, but the specific gap between what should have accumulated and what the family actually found was, by the accounts of those present during the legal and administrative process that followed, considerably wider than even a pessimistic estimate had prepared them for. Peter had earned. The recordings had sold. The performances had filled venues and generated fees across decades of consistent professional work. The catalog had demonstrated its durability by attracting genuine, renewed interest at a moment when some had assumed its peak commercial value was permanently historical. And yet the estate, when its actual composition became visible, reflected very little of that accumulated history in any proportion one might reasonably have expected. The mechanics of this kind of disappearance are rarely dramatic in any individual element. The entertainment industry of that generation possessed a remarkable and well-documented capacity for distributing the proceeds of creative work in ways that left the originating artist holding a surprisingly modest share, through the layering of management fees over agent commissions over production costs, through licensing structures that distributed income in proportions heavily favoring intermediaries, through the specific terms of arrangements signed in good faith during years when the musician was too trusting, too occupied with the work itself, or too commercially inexperienced to read what he was agreeing to with appropriate care. Peter had signed agreements across a long career with the confidence of a man whose talent was his primary currency. The fine print had been managed by people he trusted, and trust, in the world he had inhabited, is the specific vulnerability that a certain kind of professional has always known how to locate and cultivate with patient warmth across years of sustained proximity. The catalog restructuring conducted during the years when Peter's capacity to review and contest his own arrangements had been most significantly diminished was not, on paper, illegal in any straightforward sense. According to people familiar with the legal review that followed his death, the terms were technically defensible under the existing agreements. Defensible in the manner of something carefully designed to withstand scrutiny, not in the way that something honestly constructed for mutual benefit tends simply and naturally to be. By the accounts of those who later examined the estate documents, the share of future catalog income flowing toward the facilitator's interests appeared substantially larger than any equivalent arrangement made while Peter retained full capacity to negotiate. The provisions protecting Peter's estate in the event of his death were considerably thinner than an independent solicitor reviewing the documents in good faith would have recommended. The documentation of how those terms had come to be agreed was, to use the most generous available description, incomplete in ways that consistently served only one party's interests. The facilitator responded to the questions that eventually gathered around this picture in the way he had always responded to difficult questions. With warmth, with professional authority, and with the specific quality of unflappability that belongs to a man who has had considerable time to prepare his explanations and a long career spent managing difficult impressions. He had maintained the catalog through years when it might otherwise have lost all commercial traction. He had protected a name from exposures that would have permanently damaged it. He had ensured the legacy remained viable and commercially relevant. He expressed sympathy toward the family, offered carefully worded condolences, and declined to discuss specific terms of private agreements with anyone not formally party to them. He did not suggest an independent review. He did not acknowledge that anything requiring examination had taken place, and the family, grieving and legally outgunned, found themselves in the position that vulnerable people so often occupy when sophisticated skill is deployed against them. Knowing what had happened at the level of deep intuition, but lacking the instruments to prove it in the form that institutional processes require. And without that proof, nothing could officially change. What would it truly take for the people who loved Peter Posa to recover what was taken during the years when he could no longer protect it himself? And did anyone who held genuine authority in the music world ever look directly at what had been arranged and say, simply and without elaboration, that it was wrong? There was a room that almost no one knew about during Peter's final years. Not a second residence, not a hidden location of any dramatic kind, something smaller and considerably more intimate than that. A rented practice space in an ordinary building not far from where he lived, maintained under an arrangement so quiet that even people who considered themselves genuinely close to him during that period had no idea it existed. A neighbor in the building, a retired teacher who had recognized Peter from old album covers and maintained the discreet distance she considered appropriate towards someone who clearly valued his privacy, remembered seeing him arrive on certain mornings. Not regularly, not according to any fixed pattern, but periodically, carrying a case, moving with the slightly careful attention to effort of a man who does not take arrival anywhere entirely for granted. She had sometimes heard music through the closed door, not complete performances, not the polished passages of any formal session, fragments, attempts, a phrase begun and stopped, the same phrase again with some small variation, silence extending longer than ordinary practice silences extend. And then, sometimes, the phrase one more time. She had not thought of it as unusual. She had assumed it was a serious professional musician doing the private work that serious musicians do, in rooms nobody else is supposed to witness. The unglamorous repetition and testing that underlies every polished public result, invisible to audiences who encounter only the finished surface and rarely imagine the effort concealed within its apparent ease. She understood what it had meant only after his death, when the fuller picture of Peter's condition became something people in the neighborhood were quietly discussing. The room was where he had continued to try. Not for any audience, not for any recording, not for any professional purpose that could have been disclosed without simultaneously disclosing what he was working so hard to contain. He had gone there, on the mornings when his hands felt sufficiently reliable to attempt it, to hold the private conversation with the instrument he could no longer afford to hold anywhere visible. To discover, alone and without witnesses, how much remained. To measure, with the honest exactitude he had always applied to his own work, the distance between what the body could still do and the standard he had always held as the minimum beneath which he would not perform for anyone else. The room was no longer rented by the time the family learned of its existence. The arrangement had ended quietly some time before his death, whether because the mornings had stopped producing anything he recognized as music, or because the physical journey there had become too difficult to sustain, or because the private testing had finally concluded and its verdict been accepted without ceremony. No one can say with certainty. The neighbor remembered the last morning she heard music through the door. She said it was different from the other mornings, longer in its silences, quieter in its attempts, and then, at the end, a passage she recognized from one of the old recordings. Played slowly, not with the bright and precise velocity of the original, but carrying something else entirely. The same notes in the same order, bearing a weight the original had never needed to carry. She did not know it was the last time. She listened, and then the music stopped, and the footsteps moved down the corridor in the quiet way they always had, and she returned to what she had been doing. It was only in the weeks following his death that she understood she had been present at something that deserved a witness, and that the only witness available had been a retired teacher in an ordinary hallway who had the grace to listen without interrupting. If the two guitars that survived the 11 departures could remember what they heard in that room, on the mornings when no performance was required and no audience was possible, what would they tell us about the kind of courage that keeps trying when the only honest measure available is silence? Peter Posa left this world in the opening weeks of 2019. The tributes were warm, the commemorative broadcasts respectful, and the musical assessments that followed were genuinely moved by the quality of what he had produced during the years when his hands still fully obeyed him. Broadcasters ran archival recordings. Journalists wrote about his precision, his restraint, his quality of making the genuinely difficult sound entirely natural. The country acknowledged, in the way it acknowledges these things, that someone of real significance had passed, and that his recordings would hold their place in the archive of what New Zealand had made when it was first learning what it could produce. None of the official tributes mentioned the practice room. None mentioned the tape, which remained in family possession and was not shared publicly in the period immediately following his death. None mentioned the catalog arrangements that had restructured the commercial future of his legacy, while his capacity to contest them had been progressively diminished by the very illness the official story had never acknowledged. The public memory was polished and incomplete, the same polished incompleteness that had characterized the account of his final years throughout, maintained by the same people for the same reasons. Even in death, the managed version held its shape. The facilitator continued for a period after Peter's passing to present himself in the music world in the way he always had, as a thoughtful steward of a significant legacy, a professional who had managed a complex situation with care and judgment across many years. His name appeared in archival discussions. His telephone was answered promptly when broadcasters called about commemorative programming. The catalog arrangements he had secured continued to generate income in the proportions he had negotiated. The legal review initiated by the family moved slowly through solicitors' correspondence and the particular laboriousness of examining paperwork constructed by someone who understood precisely how to make paperwork difficult to examine without obvious obstruction. There were no dramatic confrontations, no public accusations, no courtroom moments of the kind such stories are sometimes expected to produce. There was instead the grinding and expensive process by which people wronged through sophisticated means attempt to establish that the wrong was committed through means sufficiently sophisticated to be defensible in each individual element. What that process eventually produced was not justice in any theatrical sense. It produced a recalibration, a quietly negotiated adjustment that shifted certain catalog rights back toward the estate and established clearer terms for future income distribution. It produced an acknowledgement, carefully worded and falling well short of any admission of wrongdoing, that certain previous arrangements had not adequately reflected the interests of all parties. The kind of outcome these processes often produce, when they produce anything at all, better than nothing, far short of full repair, arrived at so long after the original harm that its practical significance for the person most affected was entirely and irreversibly theoretical. The facilitator accepted the renegotiated terms with the same professional equanimity he had always displayed. He did not apologize. He did not offer the family any private accounting of his understanding of what had happened across those years. He continues to speak, by available accounts, of his long professional relationship with Peter in terms that emphasize his own indispensable contribution to the preservation of a valuable legacy. He has never expressed regret. The tape was eventually heard by a small number of people outside the immediate family, people whose connection to Peter was personal rather than commercial, who listened not as researchers, but as people who had known him and wanted, finally, to hear what he had been unable to say while they were all still in the same rooms together. What those listeners described afterward was not revelation in any documentary sense. The tape did not contain information that would have materially changed the legal outcome. It contained something harder to categorize than evidence. A man accounting for himself honestly, without performance, without the management of impression that had surrounded his public identity for decades, without any of the careful self-presentation that a lifetime in the public eye makes automatic even in private. More than one person who heard it described the voice as sounding like relief, as if speaking the truth into the air of an empty room, with no audience capable of being disappointed by what the truth actually was, had been a form of freedom Peter had been denying himself for considerably longer than any of them had understood. The two guitars were placed after extended deliberation by the family, with an institution whose primary purpose is the preservation and study of New Zealand's musical heritage. Not a commercial gallery, not a private collector, not any arrangement connected to the facilitator or aligned with his interests. A public collection, accessible to researchers and to anyone who simply wants to understand what the history of New Zealand popular music looked like when examined from close enough to see the real detail. They are there now, properly housed, properly documented, associated with a name the institution describes, accurately and without embellishment, as among the most significant in the country's history of instrumental music. Whether Peter would have chosen that destination himself is something no one can say with certainty, but it represents what the family understood him to have valued. Not controlled access maintained through scarcity, not mystique carefully manufactured by restricting who could encounter the work, but simple availability to anyone with enough genuine interest to look. Peter Posa gave New Zealand something that precision alone cannot explain and sentiment alone cannot preserve. He gave it a sound entirely specific to him. Clean, controlled, alive with the authority that comes only from a musician who has spent years making himself honestly answerable to the highest standard his own ear can set and hold. That sound lives in the recordings. It will remain in the recordings long after everyone who was present for any of the events described here has also passed from this world into whatever archive survives us. The illness did not touch the recordings. The catalog arrangements did not diminish the performances themselves. The moments in the studio when the hands were still fully obedient and the music arrived as quickly as it was imagined. The managed silence did not change the fact that the music, when it was made with full honesty and full skill. That belongs to Peter and to no one else. It cannot be restructured, renegotiated, managed, or taken. Friends, we want to ask you something directly, and we genuinely want to hear your answer. Peter Posa gave everything he had to the music, and then gave up almost everything else to protect the dignity of the standard he had set. He sold 11 guitars rather than perform below his own threshold. He maintained a private practice room and continued trying in silence rather than simply accept that the trying was finished. He left a tape rather than a public confession. In every private moment this story has allowed us to examine, he was a man of extraordinary honesty with himself, surrounded, at precisely the moment that honesty became most vulnerable, by people whose relationship to truth was considerably more flexible and more self-serving. So tell us in the comments, do you believe Peter Posa was a victim of the system and the people who surrounded him? Or do you think that choices he made along the way left him more exposed than he needed to be? Tell us whether people in your city still remember his music, and whether knowing this story changes the way you hear it. We read every comment. Your memory of him matters to us. If this story stayed with you, if the image of a man in a rented room, playing a familiar passage slowly into a silence no one was supposed to witness, moved something in you, press like so that more people can find their way to the full picture. Subscribe, because the stories the official version decided to leave out are almost always the ones that matter most. Peter Posa deserves more listeners, and after everything this story has shown us, he deserves a fuller truth than the one he was permitted to speak while he was still alive to speak it himself.